A little girl in a faded hoodie walked into a billionaire CEO's glass-walled office with a crayon drawing clutched in her hand. No appointment, no parent. Just one sentence that stopped his world. "You were supposed to be my dad." What followed wasn't a scandal or denial. It was a quiet unraveling of everything he thought he knew about success, love, and legacy. This isn't a story about wealth. It's about a man who didn't know he had a daughter until she found him and changed everything. What would you do if your entire life knocked on the door at age 7? The receptionist had already told her no 3 times. The first time was when the glass doors to Lockridge International spun open and a little girl stepped through them with a paper rolled tightly in her small hands and a look in her eyes that was too serious for someone so young. She wore a faded hoodie 2 sizes too big and carried no bag, no parent, no obvious reason for being there. The second time was when she insisted calmly that she had to speak with Mr. Ethan Lockridge himself. And the third time was after she added that she had walked 6 blocks by herself because it was very important. The receptionist's protest dissolved into silence then, because something about the girl's tone, not pleading, not dramatic, just sure, made it hard to dismiss her outright. Still, she had rules. No one, not even adults with credentials, got through to Mr. Lockridge without an appointment. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said gently. "You really can't go up there." "I have to," the girl repeated. She was standing so still it was unsettling, like she hadn't learned how to fidget. "I made something for him. It's not for anyone else." The paper remained clutched in her hand, the crayon smudged edges peeking out from her grip. The receptionist sighed, unsure of what to do next. She glanced toward security, but paused. The girl wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't loud or distressed. She just stood there like time had stopped until someone listened. Upstairs, the CEO in question, Ethan Lockridge, was having a very different morning. His schedule was packed: a board review, a licensing negotiation with the Berlin team, a lunch with the CFO he didn't want to take, and a media prep call for an upcoming interview on Bloomberg. Every minute of his day was accounted for. Every decision he made today would move millions of dollars. And yet, something about his morning felt off. He hadn't slept well. His dreams were full of static and silence and a face he couldn't remember. The city skyline outside his window was gray, the kind of gray that pressed on your chest like a forgotten weight. Ethan ran a hand through his graying hair, trimmed short, and blinked at his calendar. And that's when his phone buzzed with a message from Tanya, the receptionist downstairs. "There's a little girl here asking to see you. Says it's very important. She's alone. 6 or 7 maybe? Doesn't seem scared. Just insistent." Ethan frowned. "Did she say who she is?" "No, just that she needs to give you something. She won't leave. I know this is unusual, but should I send her up?" He hesitated. Every instinct said no. He had too much going on. He didn't have time for surprises. And yet, the memory of that dream gnawed at him. The silence. The feeling of something unsaid. He typed back slowly. "Send her up." 5 minutes later, the door to his office opened, and in walked the smallest guest he'd ever received. Her hoodie hung past her knees. Her shoes were mismatched. She stepped into the towering glass-walled space with all the certainty of a person used to not being heard, but refusing to be ignored. Ethan stood. "Hello?" She didn't answer. She walked straight to his desk, stood on her tiptoes, and unrolled the paper in her hand. It was a drawing done in thick, colorful crayon, rough and childlike but clear. 6 stick figures stood under a crooked sun, a tall man with glasses, a woman with long hair, and 4 children. One of the children had a speech bubble. It said, "Why didn't you come back?" Ethan stared. The girl looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper but steady as stone. "You were supposed to be my dad." The sentence stopped everything. The city noise, the hum of his office, even his thoughts, it all collapsed into stillness. He looked at her, really looked, and saw it then, the chin, the shape of her eyes. Familiar, impossibly so. His throat tightened. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice suddenly rough. "Grace." He blinked. That name shouldn't have meant anything. But it did. It stirred something buried, something shoved deep into the locked compartments of his past. "How old are you, Grace?" 7. 7 years ago, he had been in D.C. for a month, just before his company had gone global, just before his whole life became planes and projections and penthouse loneliness. 7 years ago, he had been with someone for a fleeting few weeks, Marina, a teacher, soft eyes. He hadn't stayed. He hadn't known. Grace placed the drawing in front of him, her small fingers smoothing it out. "My mom said you didn't know, but I wanted you to." Ethan sat down slowly. He didn't remember the last time his hands shook, but they were now. "Where is your mom?" he asked. "She's sick today, but I found the address. I wanted to give you this myself." "Why?" Grace looked up again, those eyes too old for her age. "Because I want to know why you didn't come back. And because I think I need you now." The sentence didn't just stop his world, it broke it open. He didn't have answers, not yet. But what he did have, what he suddenly knew with soul-wrenching certainty, was that this little girl had just walked into his life and shattered the illusion he had spent years perfecting, that he could be alone and still be whole. He looked at her drawing again, then at her, then at the empty space beside him he hadn't known was missing something. "Okay, Grace," he said, "let's talk." And just like that, everything changed. He didn't cancel his meetings, at least not right away. Ethan Lockridge was still a CEO, still the orchestrator of a billion-dollar empire. But the man who sat across from Grace for the next hour was not the man who barked orders into Bluetooth headsets or pored over quarterly reports with red pen precision. This man listened, really listened. Not because it was the right thing to do, not even because he knew what to say next, but because his world had just turned upside down, and he was grasping for the only truth he had, her. Grace talked like someone who had grown used to carrying thoughts too heavy for her age. She told him that she liked purple, but not lavender, too sleepy-looking, that her mom made the best grilled cheese when she wasn't sick, that she used to draw pictures of her dad before bed even though she wasn't sure what he looked like. "I always thought maybe you'd be tall," she said thoughtfully, tilting her head as if measuring. "You are." Ethan smiled, but it was a fragile thing, barely holding together the avalanche of emotions building inside him. He hadn't asked yet, hadn't dared to ask, what her mother had told her about him, about why he'd never come, why he hadn't been there to hold her hand on her first day of school, or read her bedtime stories, or notice the way she cradled her crayon box like it was made of glass. He hadn't asked because he wasn't sure he could survive the answer. Instead, he asked something smaller, something safer. "Do you want something to eat?" Grace nodded, and he buzzed his assistant. "Bring up a snack tray," he said, "and cancel my next meeting. Tell them I'm indisposed." He didn't offer an explanation. There wasn't one he could give. Not yet. While they waited, Grace climbed into the leather guest chair opposite his desk, her little legs swinging because they didn't quite reach the floor. She looked around with wide eyes, taking in the clean lines of the office, the wall of glass behind him, the towering bookshelf that stretched almost to the ceiling. "This place smells like a hotel," she said finally. He laughed, quietly, unexpectedly. "I guess it kind of does." "Do you live here?" "No," he said, "but sometimes it feels like I do." That earned him a small smile. Not big, not beaming, but genuine. And it hit him like a dart to the chest. How many of those smiles had he missed? How many years had passed where this girl, his daughter, had been right here in the same city growing up without him even knowing? The snack tray arrived. Fruit, cheese, crackers, a small cup of apple juice, and she thanked the assistant politely, her voice careful, controlled. Ethan watched her pick through the food like she'd learned not to take too much. Like hunger had never been about just appetite. "She's sick," Grace said after a few minutes of silence. "My mom. Some days are better. Some are not." "What kind of sick?" Grace shrugged. "She says it's in her blood, that it makes her tired and dizzy. Sometimes she sleeps all day, but she always wakes up when I get home. She always makes dinner if she can." Ethan's throat tightened. He wanted to ask more, needed to, but every question felt like an accusation, and he didn't want to put that weight on Grace's small shoulders. Instead, he said, "Would you mind if I talk to your mom? Maybe tomorrow, or whenever she feels up to it." Grace studied him carefully. "Will you get mad at her?" "What? No, why would I?" "Because she said she didn't tell you, that it was her choice. She didn't want to mess up your life." Ethan went still. His jaw clenched, not in anger, but in guilt. He had no idea what had happened between them, why Marina had chosen to keep the truth from him, but he believed Grace, believed her mother had made a decision not out of spite, but protection, and he knew deep down that it must have hurt like hell for her to do it. "I won't be mad," he said. "I just want to understand." Grace nodded slowly, as if testing the sincerity of his words. Then she reached into her hoodie pocket and pulled out another piece of paper, folded into quarters. "This is her number," she said. "I wrote it down just in case you said yes." He took the paper like it was glass, unfolding it carefully, a simple string of digits, scrawled in purple crayon. Grace yawned then, just a little one, the kind that crept up on her, and he looked at the clock. Almost noon. How long had she been up? How far had she walked? He couldn't imagine letting his own assistant's daughter do something so bold, so dangerous. And yet, here she was. "Do you want me to call a cab to take you home?" he asked. She hesitated. "Could you come with me instead?" The question knocked the breath out of him. "Now?" he asked, stunned. She nodded. "It's not far." Ethan looked down at the paper again, then at the drawing on his desk, then at Grace, her eyes hopeful but cautious, like someone used to disappointment. He stood. "Let me grab my coat." They took the elevator down in silence, the high polished floor reflecting their mismatched steps, his long and measured, hers short and light. In the lobby, Tanya looked up and blinked twice at the sight of them together. "I'll be out for a while," Ethan said. "Hold my calls." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Outside, Grace led the way. Not with certainty, but with quiet confidence. And Ethan followed her, the city moving around them like a hum. He had walked these streets 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never behind a child who held half his face in her features and a whole universe of questions in her chest. When they reached the building, an old walk-up with chipped paint and cracked steps, Grace stopped. "We live on the second floor, apartment 2B. Ethan swallowed. It looked clean but tired, like a place that had been maintained through love, not luxury. "Are you sure she's okay with visitors?" "She'll be surprised, but she won't yell." He nodded and followed her up the stairs. And with every step, the world he thought he knew receded behind him, until he stood at the threshold of a door he hadn't known existed, and knocked. ChatGPT said. The knock echoed softly down the worn hallway, where muted light from a single overhead bulb flickered with the uncertain rhythm of a heartbeat. Ethan stood there with Grace beside him, suddenly unsure of everything, his words, his timing, even his right to be on the other side of this door. A part of him wanted to run. Another part, the one that had kept her drawing in his coat pocket folded neatly like something sacred, refused to move. The door opened slowly. She looked different than he remembered. Marina's face was thinner now, her cheeks a little hollowed, dark shadows gathering beneath her eyes, like secrets that had refused to leave. But her eyes, those soft, steady eyes, were exactly the same. And the moment they landed on Grace, and then on him, the silence between them became thunder. "Hi, Mom," Grace said quietly. Marina's gaze flicked from her daughter to Ethan and back again. Her body stiffened slightly, but she didn't panic. She didn't shout. She exhaled instead, as if she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "You found him." Grace nodded. "He said he'd come." Marina stepped aside wordlessly and let them in. The apartment was small, but clean. Sparse furniture. A tiny kitchen tucked into one corner. A bookshelf stacked with children's books and medical pamphlets. The windows let in streaks of soft light, filtering over the scuffed wooden floor where a blanket and a few stuffed animals made a kind of play space. Ethan entered cautiously, like a man trespassing on hallowed ground. Marina didn't offer coffee. She didn't ask why he was there. She only waited until Grace curled up on the couch and turned on a low-volume cartoon, then gestured toward the kitchen. They stepped into the corner nook, just out of earshot. "She's wanted to meet you for a long time," Marina said, her voice flat but not cold. "But I didn't know how to do it without turning her world upside down." "It turned mine upside down instead," Ethan said. She looked down at her hands, folding and unfolding the hem of her sweater. "I didn't keep her from you out of anger. I need you to understand that." "Then why?" he asked. "Why didn't you call me? Write me? Something?" "Because I didn't think you'd want her." The words hit like a slap, not because they were cruel, but because they felt honest. "You were on the edge of something huge, Ethan. Your company was just about to go global. You had teams in 5 countries. You were in the paper every week. And I was just me, a part-time art teacher with a 1-bedroom and no family nearby. You thought I wouldn't care? I thought you'd do what powerful men do, offer support from a distance, a check every month, maybe a visit at Christmas. But she didn't need a name on a letterhead. She needed someone who'd see her, who'd show up. And you didn't think I could be that?" Marina's lips trembled just slightly. "No, I thought you didn't know how." Ethan didn't argue. He couldn't. Everything she'd said felt like a mirror held up to the life he'd lived, the way he'd buried himself in boardrooms, the way he'd avoided attachments, relationships, anything unpredictable. Until now. "I'm not angry," he said. I wish I'd known." "I know? And I want to be here now, if you'll let me." She finally looked up at him then, not with suspicion, not with bitterness, but with a cautious, lingering ache that said she'd once imagined this, then taught herself to stop. "You want to be her father?" "I am her father." Marina blinked, and a tear escaped before she could catch it. "She's smart," she whispered. "She's so smart, and kind, and too quiet sometimes, like she's always worried about saying too much." "I saw that," he said softly. "She draws every day, people, places, things she wants to remember, things she's afraid of forgetting." Ethan's eyes stung. "Like me." "Yes," Marina said. "And for months, she's been asking to find you. I kept telling her, not yet. Not until it's safer. Not until I'm better." "What's wrong, Marina?" he asked carefully. "Grace said you were sick." She hesitated, and for a moment he saw the wall start to rise in her again. Pride, shame, fear, all stacked together. But then she sighed. "It's autoimmune," she said. "Lupus, diagnosed last year. Some days are fine, some are hell. I can't work like I used to. Grace does more for me than any 7-year-old should." Ethan's hands curled into fists. "Why didn't you tell someone? Ask for help?" She smiled faintly. "I've asked for help before. Not everyone offers it without strings." He stepped forward then, gently, carefully, as if trying not to startle her. "I don't have strings, Marina. Just regrets, and a lot of lost time I want to make up for." Her breath hitched, but she didn't look away. "She's been waiting for you, Ethan. She drew that picture over a year ago, the one she gave you." "I know," he whispered. "So what do you want now?" He didn't hesitate. "I want to be part of her life. However you'll let me. I want to take her to school, go to her art shows, sit in the front row when she reads a poem or wins a spelling bee. I want to help you when the days are hard. I want to—" He stopped. swallowed. I want to learn how to be the man she already thinks I am. Marina stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded once, slowly, almost imperceptibly. All right, she said. Then let's start there. They returned to the living room together. Grace looked up, her eyes wide, searching her mother's face. Marina smiled gently. Looks like he's going to stick around. Grace beamed, and in that moment, Ethan knew he had just found the most important job he would ever have. Ethan didn't go back to the office that day. His team could handle the rest of the meetings. The world wouldn't stop spinning if he didn't approve another pitch deck or negotiate another margin. What he had instead was a plate of grilled cheese halves and an afternoon spent learning how to listen to a child he hadn't known existed. Grace talked more once the tension faded, once the room began to feel less like a confrontation and more like a living room again. She showed him her sketchbook, a collection of colored pencil portraits, fantasy creatures, places she wanted to go. One drawing showed a house with a red door and a massive backyard. It had 6 windows and a garden with carrots. This is the house I want one day, she explained, tapping the chimney, with a dog named Crayon. Crayon? Ethan asked, trying not to smile. Because he'll be all different colors. Of course. She showed him another one. A woman in a hospital bed, eyes closed, hand held by a child. That one's about when Mom got really sick last Christmas, she said, voice low. I thought she might not wake up. Ethan swallowed, hard. The idea of his daughter living through something so terrifying without him there to reassure her, to hold her, to protect her, it ignited something deep and angry and helpless in him. Marina had stepped into the kitchen, letting them talk. She moved slowly, methodically, and every now and then he could see her pause, just for a second, to catch her breath or steady her balance. He watched her with a different kind of attention now. Not the gaze of a man remembering an old flame, but the kind of gaze you give someone who's carried far more than they ever should have had to carry, quietly and without recognition. When she came back in, he asked her if she had help, family, friends, anyone. I have some friends, she said. They've brought groceries when I've had flares. One of them sometimes picks Grace up from school, but mostly it's just us. You shouldn't have to do this alone. I've had 7 years of practice. He didn't have a good answer to that, but he made a silent vow. The next 7 would look different. He stayed until early evening, helping clean up, reading part of a book aloud, while Grace leaned against her mother's side. When she started to nod off mid-sentence, Marina looked at him. She'll sleep hard tonight. Talking to you took more energy than she'll admit. I'd like to see her again, soon. Marina nodded. We can talk tomorrow about how to do this. He stood and hesitated. Thank you for not shutting the door. I thought about it, she said, almost smiling. But she believed in you more than I doubted you. Those words stayed with him long after he left, long after he climbed into the back of a black town car and rode in silence back to his apartment, long after he loosened his tie and sat on the edge of his bed, still in disbelief over the life that had opened in front of him like a secret room behind a bookshelf. That night, he didn't pour himself scotch. He didn't open a laptop or turn on the news. He took out Grace's drawing again and unfolded it carefully. The little stick figure with the glasses, the speech bubble. Why didn't you come back? He stared at that question, feeling the weight of it settle on his chest like a truth he'd have to carry every day from now on, not as punishment but as responsibility. He hadn't come back because he hadn't known, but now he did, and he was going to stay. The next morning, he called Marina, not with an agenda, just to check in. I'm not sure what the rules are yet, he said, but I figured I'd start with good morning. She laughed, a soft, real laugh. She's already asking when you'll visit again. Today, if that's okay. They worked it out. Ethan came by in the early afternoon, this time with a bag of art supplies he'd picked up after speaking to a friend who ran an education nonprofit. Markers, paints, fancy sketch pads. "For your studio," he told Grace, "when you open it." She looked at the bag like it was treasure. "You remembered." "Of course I did." Marina watched it all from the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea. And for the first time in a long time, her eyes didn't look tired. They looked cautious, but softer. That visit turned into another, and another. Days passed, then a week. Ethan adjusted his schedule without complaint. His staff noticed, of course, his once inflexible routines now bending around mysterious personal commitments. But he didn't explain. He didn't have to. His world had changed, and he was learning to move within it differently. Grace would fall asleep on his shoulder during movie nights. Marina would sometimes let her guard down enough to laugh at one of his clumsy jokes. Their dinners became routines, simple, homemade, full of warmth. It was still messy, still uncertain, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Ethan Lockridge didn't feel like he was performing his life. He felt like he was living it. 2 weeks later, the first real test came, not with an outburst or a rejection, but with a field trip form. Grace came running to the door when Ethan arrived that Thursday, waving a sheet of paper in her hand with her backpack sliding off one shoulder. "Mom said I could ask you," she said breathlessly. "Can you come with us tomorrow? It's the art museum. We're going on the big yellow buses." He took the paper, read the details: departure at 8:30 a.m., chaperones needed, packed lunches required, and blinked. Not because he was unsure about saying yes, but because it was the first time anyone had asked him to show up somewhere, not as a speaker or a sponsor or a name on a wall. Just a presence. Just a pair of hands to hold juice boxes and point at paintings. "I'd love to," he said. Grace grinned so hard her cheeks bunched up into dimples he hadn't noticed before. "You have to sign it. Sign right there, next to parent or guardian." The pen shook slightly in his hand. Parent or guardian. The words hit harder than he expected. He signed it. Marina leaned against the kitchen counter, her face unreadable. When Grace bounded off to pack her bag with unnecessary trinkets, Ethan turned to her. "Was that okay?" She nodded. "I think it's more than okay." "You sure? I don't want to take over." "You're not. You're showing up, and that's something she hasn't had from anyone else." He looked down. "I missed so much." "But you're here now," she said softly, "and she knows it." The next morning, Ethan wore jeans and a navy sweater, an attempt at looking approachable, even though every inch of him still felt like a suit. He arrived early at Grace's school, coffee in hand, feeling more nervous than he had walking into a shareholder meeting. The kids came in waves, buzzing with excitement and noise. When Grace saw him, she didn't shout or run. She just walked over and took his hand, as naturally as if they'd done it every morning of her life. "This is my dad," she told her teacher. The woman smiled in surprise. "I didn't know." "We just found each other," Grace said simply. The teacher nodded. "Well, we're glad to have you, Mr. Lockridge." He smiled awkwardly. "Ethan's fine." They rode the bus together. Grace nestled beside him, chattering about her favorite paintings, how she wanted to live in the museum one day, how she wished she could draw ceilings like the ones in the rotunda. At the museum, she pulled him from room to room, showing him impressionists, modernists, ancient sculptures with missing limbs. "This one," she said, stopping in front of a painting of a woman with a tired, dreamy face, "looks like Mom, when she's sad, but pretending not to be." Ethan said nothing for a moment, just looked, then knelt beside her. "You're really good at noticing things." Grace shrugged. "I just draw what I see." At lunch, he sat on a stone bench while Grace and her classmates traded apple slices and cookie halves. Another parent, a woman with a yoga mat poking out of her tote, leaned over. "So," she said, "you're Grace's dad? I didn't realize." "It's new," he said honestly. "Well, she talks about you like you've been around forever." He looked over at Grace, who was laughing with a boy in glasses, her face flushed and bright. "She's making up for lost time," he said. That night, back at Marina's apartment, she waited for him by the window, arms folded. "She told me you were the best chaperone," she said with a smile. "I only lost track of her once." "Not bad." "She said something at the museum," he said, slipping his coat off, "about how you look when you're pretending not to be sad." Marina's smile faded slightly. "She's observant," she said. "Too much sometimes." She said she just draws what she sees. Marina turned away, suddenly quiet. He stepped closer. "I want to help," he said gently. "Not just show up sometimes. I want to take some of this off your shoulders." "I don't need charity, Ethan. This isn't charity. It's parenting." Marina looked at him for a long time, her eyes wary. "I don't know how to let someone in halfway." "Then don't," he said. "Let me all the way in. Let's figure it out together." The silence between them this time was warm, not sharp. She nodded slowly. "Okay, let's try." And from that moment, they did. He took over pickups twice a week, started a savings account in Grace's name, sat beside Marina during hospital visits when her symptoms flared. Grocery runs became part of his schedule. Sometimes they cooked dinner together, elbows bumping as they chopped vegetables. Sometimes they didn't speak much, just existed in the same room, comfortably. Grace began drawing pictures of 3 people instead of 2. One day she handed Ethan a folded paper while they waited for Marina's prescription at the pharmacy. He opened it and saw the stick figure of himself holding Grace's hand, both of them standing beside a house with a red door. Above it she'd written, "This is the one where you stayed." He stared at it for a long time, and then slowly he smiled. Ethan kept the drawing in his wallet, not because it was polished or perfect, but because it was the first time anyone had ever drawn him into a future. Every time he opened his wallet for a credit card, a receipt, a business card, there it was, a house with a red door, a girl with mismatched socks, and a man who had decided to stay. He showed it to no one. It was just for him. The weeks stretched into months. Slowly his life began to take on a rhythm he hadn't known he was missing. Board meetings were still part of it. He still signed contracts, still advised startups, and oversaw expansions. But now his days had new markers: school pickup at 3:10, Sunday art supply runs, bedtime stories he sometimes stumbled through when he was too tired to read clearly, but too full of wonder to stop. Grace didn't ask for much. She never had. But she accepted his presence like someone who had always hoped it might arrive. One Friday night, as rain battered the apartment windows and the smell of pasta filled the air, Marina looked up from the couch, her legs tucked under her. "You know," she said, "this isn't how I imagined it." He was sitting on the floor, attempting to glue 2 popsicle sticks into a miniature easel for one of Grace's dioramas. "What isn't?" "This you, here, with us." Ethan looked up. "Better or worse?" She smiled. "Better, and much, much weirder. I can live with weird." They laughed, and Grace, on the floor beside him, beamed like she was seeing the sun come up for the first time. That night, after Grace was asleep, Ethan lingered. Marina poured 2 mugs of tea and handed him one without asking. It was the sort of domestic exchange that once would have made him feel trapped. Now it made him feel tethered to something real. "She adores you," Marina said. "I adore her back." "I know. That's why I need to ask you something." He set his mug down. "Anything." Marina hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I'm getting sicker." Ethan stilled. "I've had 2 flare-ups in the last month. The meds help, but the doctors are cautious. If it gets worse, I won't be able to keep working, or driving, or even—" She stopped. "I've been thinking about the future, Grace's future." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if something happens, I want her to have someone who won't flinch, someone who'll stay." "I will." "I need more than a promise." Ethan leaned forward, eyes locked on hers. "Tell me what you need." "I want you to be her legal guardian. If, God forbid, This disease takes a sharper turn. I want her to go to you, not into the system, not to some distant cousin she's never met. You." He swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." He reached for her hand, held it gently. "Then it's done." The paperwork was drawn up 2 weeks later. Quietly, efficiently. A lawyer who specialized in guardianship guided them through it. Ethan didn't tell anyone at the office. He didn't need applause. What he needed was to know that if the world shifted again, if it broke in some new way, he'd be there to steady the pieces. Grace didn't know the details, but she sensed the change. She started calling him Dad one day without warning, not loudly, not ceremoniously, just a whispered, "Thanks, Dad," as he handed her a snack in the car. He didn't correct her. He couldn't even speak. He just reached for her hand and held it as they drove, tears clouding his view of the traffic lights ahead. The years ahead would not be easy. Marina's health remained unpredictable. Grace grew, taller, louder, occasionally moody, and Ethan fumbled his way through the maze of school projects, doctor visits, sleepovers, and heartbreaks. He was not perfect, but he was present, and that, Grace often said, was more than enough. One spring morning, they stood in front of a familiar brick building where Grace's artwork was being featured in a student gallery. She was 12 now, wearing a blazer too big for her and a smile too bright to ignore. Her painting hung in the center, a house with a red door. 3 figures stood in front of it, a girl, a woman with tired eyes and a soft smile, and a tall man with silver at his temples and his hand resting gently on the girl's shoulder. There was no speech bubble this time, just a title scribbled in the corner, "The Day He Stayed." Ethan didn't cry. He just stood there, staring at the painting, letting the truth of it settle into his bones. Because the thing about redemption is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, daily, like pencil strokes on paper, until one day you look up and realize you've been drawn into a life you never planned but desperately needed. And you've stayed. For good. That night, after the art gallery reception, Ethan tucked Grace into bed and paused longer than usual at her doorway. She was halfway beneath her covers, her sketch pad still open beside her pillow, filled with half-drawn ideas and layered shading. Her eyes were already drifting shut, but when she sensed him lingering, she looked up through sleepy lashes. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah, just proud of you." Her lips curled into a drowsy smile. "You're in all my best drawings now." That sentence lodged itself somewhere deep in his chest, and he couldn't speak for a moment. All his accolades, all his headlines and honors and certificates etched in glass. None of them had ever meant as much as that simple sentence, mumbled between yawns by the daughter he hadn't even known existed just months ago. He closed her door gently and walked into the quiet apartment. Marina was in the kitchen, sipping chamomile tea and rubbing her temple. She'd been strong all evening, but he could see the exhaustion beginning to thread its way into her features again. "I'm not pushing through anymore," she said, watching him approach. "That's new." "You mean?" "I used to just keep going, even when my body was screaming, for her, for survival. But now, knowing you're here, it's like I finally believe I can stop pretending to be invincible." Ethan placed a hand on her back. "You never had to be. You were just alone." She leaned into his touch, resting her head against his shoulder. It was quiet between them, and that quiet didn't need to be filled. It wasn't emptiness, it was safety. "Have you thought more about the house?" she asked eventually. He blinked. "The house?" "The red door," she said, smiling faintly. "She draws it so often I figured it might be time to make it real." He hesitated. "You want to move?" "I want us to move. Somewhere with space, with light. A garden if you're feeling ambitious." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "You're serious?" "I think we need something new, not just for her, but for us." That word, us. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He nodded slowly. "I'll start looking this week." They found the house 3 weeks later. It didn't have a red door, but Grace painted one after the final box was unpacked and the garden hose was coiled neatly on the porch. The house sat on a quiet street lined with sycamores. It had creaky floorboards, 3 bedrooms, a crooked chimney, and more sunlight than Ethan had seen in years. He moved his things in gradually, less of a takeover and more of a blend. His minimalist furniture softened by Grace's drawings taped to the fridge and Marina's yarn baskets stacked in corners for days when her hands didn't tremble. They built new rituals. Saturday mornings were for pancakes, burnt edges and all. Wednesday nights were for board games and stories. Sunday afternoons were for garden work. Grace in overalls, Marina directing from the shade, Ethan doing his best not to ruin the tomatoes. One afternoon, as they pulled weeds and laughed about Grace naming every plant after a cartoon character, a delivery van pulled into the driveway. Marina looked confused. "What did you order?" Ethan smiled sheepishly. "Something she deserves." Inside the van were parts and panels, boards and rods, screws and fabric. A studio. Grace's studio. He spent a full weekend assembling it in the corner of the converted garage. White walls, natural light, a desk with drawers just the right height. Marina cried when she saw it. Grace stood in the doorway for almost 5 minutes, silent. Then she turned and whispered, "No one's ever made me something before." That night Ethan sat with Marina on the back porch, the stars above them blinking softly. "Do you ever think," she said, "about how none of this was supposed to happen? All the time. And you don't regret it." He looked out across the yard where Grace had just placed a lantern on the edge of her new studio's window. "I regret everything I missed," he said, "but not a second of what's come after." Spring turned to summer, and the house began to feel less like a plan and more like a heartbeat. Grace made friends in the neighborhood. Marina had good days, more of them than before. And Ethan, for the first time in years, stopped checking his email past 7 p.m. He was present for family dinners, for school recitals, for slow mornings when Grace dragged her feet getting dressed, and Marina teased him about being the one who rushed now. One night, as he tucked Grace into bed, she handed him a sealed envelope. "What's this?" "Assignment from school," she said. "We were supposed to write letters to our future selves. I made 2, one for me and one for you." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence. "You're doing a really good job being my dad." He didn't cry. He just held her hand until she fell asleep. The next few months passed not in a blur, but in a steady stream of moments that etched themselves into Ethan's memory more deeply than any investor meeting or corporate milestone ever had. There was the first time Grace called out for him in the middle of the night, startled by a thunderstorm. She hadn't hesitated, hadn't paused to reconsider whether it was allowed. She had just called, "Dad?" into the dark, and his heart had thudded like a drum as he rushed to her room. She was standing at the edge of her bed, hair messy, eyes wide. He wrapped her in his arms and whispered, "I'm here." That night they sat together on the couch wrapped in an old blanket, eating crackers and watching the rain slide down the windows like a lullaby. When she finally drifted off against his chest, he didn't move for a long time. He just sat there listening to the sound of her breathing as though it was the only sound that mattered. There was also the time Marina relapsed harder than usual. She collapsed while folding laundry, her knees giving out without warning, and Grace had been the one to catch her, or try to. The laundry basket had spilled, shirts and socks flung like startled birds. Grace called Ethan in tears, voice shaking. He broke every speed limit to get home. He found Marina on the couch, pale but coherent, Grace clinging to her hand like an anchor. "It's getting worse," Marina whispered once Grace was asleep, "and I'm so scared of what that means for her." Ethan didn't respond with false hope or fragile comfort. He just took Marina's hand and said, "Then we fight harder. and we fight together. The hospital visits increased. Specialists were brought in. Ethan spared no resource, no connection, no favor left uncalled. And for a while, things stabilized. Not cured, never cured, but steadied. Like a ship in choppy waters, learning how to move without capsizing. Marina's spirit never faltered. She refused to let the illness define her, refused to let it take more than it already had. But she also learned how to rest when she needed to. She allowed Ethan to help, to carry what she no longer could. That balance, that trust, it deepened what they shared beyond anything physical. It wasn't just romance. It was partnership in its rawest, most necessary form. One day, as they sat in the backyard watching Grace paint on the patio, Marina said, "You know, sometimes I wonder if you would have shown up if she hadn't walked into your office." Ethan looked at her. "Would you hate me if the answer was no?" She shook her head. "I wouldn't hate you, but I might never have known the kind of man you really are." He nodded slowly. "She saved me. I didn't know it then, but she did." Grace, as if on cue, looked up and grinned, paint smudged across her cheek. "Can we order pizza?" Marina laughed. "Only if you let me pick the toppings this time." Grace groaned theatrically. "But you always choose boring ones." Ethan stood. "What if I pick? I can be the tiebreaker." Grace narrowed her eyes. "You pick pineapple, and that's it. You're out of the family." They laughed, all of them, the kind of laughter that chases shadows from corners and makes walls feel like warm embraces. That night, while Marina rested, Ethan helped Grace with her latest school project, a report on someone who had changed her life. "Can I write about you?" she asked, pencil hovering over the first line. He blinked. "Me?" She nodded. "The assignment says someone who made things better. And I think you're that person." He cleared his throat. His voice caught on something raw and unspoken. "Only if you tell the truth," he said, "that I made a lot of mistakes, that I missed too much." Grace shrugged. "I'll just say you showed up when it mattered." He turned away briefly to compose himself. "That's fair." She scribbled her opening line with great concentration. "My dad didn't always know he was my dad, but when he found out, he did everything to become one." Ethan didn't sleep much that night, not because he was worried, but because he had never felt more awake in his life. Autumn arrived slowly, slipping in beneath their windows and swirling gold leaves across the front steps of the house with the red door. Grace began wearing her favorite scarf again, a ridiculous rainbow knit that she insisted made her smarter. Marina's good days fluctuated, but she managed walks in the late afternoon sun, her steps slow but steady. Ethan raked the leaves one-handed while holding Grace's latest spelling list in the other. Their lives, once fragile and unsure, had found a kind of rhythm. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And then came the call. It was from the school office. Grace hadn't fainted exactly, but she'd gotten dizzy during recess, and when asked, admitted she hadn't eaten breakfast. Again. Marina had been asleep that morning, too weak to stand. Ethan had been out early for a meeting he couldn't move. Grace had quietly packed her bag, walked herself to the bus stop, and kept the whole system running because that's what she did. He raced to the school, heart pounding. By the time he got there, she was seated in the nurse's office, legs swinging off the cot, coloring a picture of a dog with 3 heads. "Hi, Dad," she said without looking up. He crouched beside her. "Are you okay?" She nodded. "I just didn't want to wake Mom. She needed rest more than I needed waffles." His jaw clenched. "Sweetheart, you don't have to carry the world. That's not your job." She looked up then, eyes wide. "But if I don't, who will?" He swallowed. "Me, I will. That's what I'm here for." She blinked at him, trying to decide if she believed him. And he realized this wasn't just a moment. It was the moment, the one where her future sense of safety would either anchor or fracture. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key. "What's that?" "It's yours. It's to my office. For you." She tilted her head. Why? Because if something's ever wrong, if you're scared, if you just need pancakes, you come straight to me, no appointment needed. Grace smiled softly. Even if you're in a meeting? Especially if I'm in a meeting. Later that evening, after Grace was asleep and the house was still, he told Marina what had happened. She sat at the kitchen table, guilt threading through her fingers like smoke. I can't do it all, she whispered. No one can. She needs so much. I hate feeling like I'm the reason she's growing up too fast. Ethan sat beside her. She's growing up strong, and she's not doing it alone. I think it's time, Marina said quietly. Time to make it official. He stared at her. What do you mean? I want you to be her father, on paper, legally. I want her to have your name, your protection, your presence, not just in spirit, in fact. The weight of those words settled into his chest like something permanent. You're sure? I've never been more sure. The process took months. Court appointments, home assessments, background checks. Ethan passed them all with clinical ease, though they made him feel more exposed than any audit or due diligence process ever had. Grace watched the process with curiosity, but no anxiety. She already saw him as her father. The rest, to her, was just catch-up paperwork. On the day the judge signed the final document, Grace insisted on wearing her fanciest dress, the one with the shiny buttons and the tulle skirt she said made her look like a CEO ballerina. The courtroom was small, simple, quiet. When the judge asked Grace if she wanted Mr. Lockridge to be her legal parent, she didn't hesitate. He already is, she said. We're just making it official so everyone else knows too. The gavel hit the block. Papers were signed, and when they walked out into the sunlight, Ethan knelt down, pulled out a small velvet box, and handed it to Grace. She opened it and gasped. Inside was a custom silver bracelet. On the inside, engraved in tiny cursive letters, were the words, "The day we chose each other." She threw her arms around his neck and held him so tightly he couldn't breathe, but he didn't care. He didn't need breath. He needed this. That night they celebrated with takeout and music and drawings taped to every surface of the house. Marina watched them from the couch, hand resting on her stomach, eyes misty. "You okay?" Ethan asked, sitting beside her. "I am," she said. "For the first time in a very, very long time, I really am." Grace danced barefoot across the living room, the bracelet sparkling on her wrist, her laughter rising like bells through the night. Ethan watched her and thought, this is it. This is what it means to be alive. Not the deals, not the wealth, not the headlines. This, the girl who had walked into his office with a drawing and a question that shattered him. The woman who had carried too much and still offered him grace. The family he hadn't known he was missing until it was standing in front of him with crayons and courage. They had saved him, and now, finally, fully, he was theirs. Winter crept in with a kind of quiet authority, blanketing the neighborhood in frost and silencing the morning birds. Grace was the first to notice how the windows steamed differently, how her breath turned silver in the air as she ran outside to check if the pond had frozen enough for skating. Ethan stood at the doorway, coffee in hand, watching her trace lines in the frost with one mittened finger. He was struck by how fully she lived in the moment, how each day with her was a reminder that presence wasn't about grand gestures. It was about seeing, noticing, staying. Inside, Marina was curled in the armchair, a knitted blanket draped over her legs. She was thinner these days, not dramatically so, but enough for Ethan to track it with silent concern. Her flare-ups had become more frequent, her fatigue deeper. And yet she smiled more, laughed easier, like knowing she wasn't alone had created space for softness to bloom. "Thinking about skating again?" she asked as Ethan walked back in. "She's convinced we're going to compete in the Olympics," he said, grinning. "She says I'll be her coach, but only if I learn to skate backwards." Marina chuckled. You'd better start practicing. He sat beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. How are you feeling today? She leaned into his hand. Tired? But here? That answer had become one of his favorites. Not perfect, not fixed, just here. It was enough. They spent the holidays wrapped in simplicity. Grace helped hang ornaments on a second-hand tree they decorated with popcorn garlands and hand-painted stars. Ethan had never spent a Christmas outside of a resort or a high-rise suite. But this tiny living room with mismatched socks, laughter in the kitchen, and cocoa stains on the rug was the first one that felt like Christmas had meant something. On New Year's Eve, Grace insisted they write resolutions and seal them in envelopes. Ethan said, "Stay present, stay real. Protect what matters." Marina said, "Ask for help. Accept love. Laugh more." Grace wrote, "Draw something every day. Hug more people. Learn how to make pancakes without burning them." "Good luck with that last one," Ethan teased. She smirked. "I learned from watching you." They fell asleep that night in a house that didn't echo anymore. By mid-January, something shifted. Grace came home with a flyer from school, a notice about a Parents and Heroes Career Day, where students could invite someone they admired to talk about what they did and how they helped others. She set the flyer down beside Ethan's coffee. "I want you to come," she said. Ethan blinked. "Me?" She nodded, eyes bright. "You don't have to talk about money stuff, just talk about how you help people now." He stared at her, unsure how to answer. Once upon a time his work had been measured in earnings, acquisitions, equity. But now? "I don't know what I do anymore," he admitted. "You're my dad," she said. "That's enough." The following week he stood in front of a classroom of fourth graders with trembling hands and a speech scribbled on a note card he never looked at. Grace sat in the front row, chin in her hands, watching him like he was a movie she'd already seen but still loved. "I used to think being successful meant always winning," he told the class. "But then I met someone who taught me that showing up matters more than anything else. That loving people right, consistently, quietly, is the hardest and most important work in the world." He glanced at Grace. "She saved me," he said, "and now I try to show up in all the ways she needs, and I don't always get it right. But I try." Afterward, Grace hugged him in front of her classmates without shame. "You didn't even cry," she whispered. "Almost," he said, kissing the top of her head. "Almost." As spring approached, Marina's health dipped again. The doctors adjusted medications, recalibrated dosages, added new specialists. She spent more days in bed, more nights quietly watching Ethan and Grace from her doorway like she was memorizing them. One morning, she asked Ethan to sit beside her, their room still dim with sleep. "I'm not scared anymore," she said. "Of what?" "Of leaving her alone. I used to lie awake thinking no one would ever love her the way I do. But I was wrong." He didn't say anything, just took her hand. "I need to ask you one more thing," she said. "It's not about documents or court filings. Anything. When she's older, when she forgets some of the little things, will you remind her who I was? Not just the sick parts, but the good ones, the silly ones. Will you remind her I sang off-key and burned rice and snorted when I laughed?" He swallowed against the lump in his throat. "I promise. She deserves to remember the whole version of me. She will." That night, Ethan found Grace asleep in her studio, cradled by her beanbag chair, a sketch pad resting on her chest. He lifted it carefully and flipped to the last drawing. It was of Marina sitting beneath the sycamore tree in their backyard. Her eyes were closed, her smile soft, a book in her lap. The style was more detailed now, shading, lines, movement. Grace was getting better, more precise, more confident. At the top she'd written, "My first hero," and at the bottom, "My forever one." Ethan carried her to bed, kissed her forehead, and stood at her door long after she'd fallen asleep. Some stories don't end with fireworks. Some end with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat against silence, with a girl safe in her home, a mother wrapped in memory, and a man who, once lost in numbers and names, finally found his place in the smallest moments of an ordinary, extraordinary life. Grace was 13 the first time she truly tested him. It wasn't malicious, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakably the moment where childhood softened and adolescence began to rear its head, clumsy and full of corners. She had stayed late after school for art club and forgotten to call. Marina had been resting. Ethan had arrived at the school in a full panic, only to find her walking out of the building with her sketchbook under one arm, earbuds in, utterly unbothered. He didn't yell, but the fear in his voice made her pause. "Do you know what it's like to come here and not know where you are?" Grace rolled her eyes. "I'm not a baby, Dad." "No, but I'm still your parent, and I get to worry." "I'm fine," she said, brushing past him. That night, she barely spoke at dinner. The silence at the table was heavier than the sound of raised voices ever could have been. Later, he knocked on her door. "I don't want to fight," he said gently. "Then don't," she muttered from her bed, turned away from him. "I'm learning too," he said. "You didn't come with a manual." She turned slowly. Her eyes were still fire, but behind it, something else flickered. Uncertainty. Sadness. "I'm scared all the time," she said suddenly. "Scared Mom will get worse. Scared if I leave the house something bad will happen. So sometimes I pretend I'm not scared at all. But then I do stuff like today. And I don't even know if I'm mad at you or me." He sat beside her, quiet for a long time. "You're allowed to be scared," he said finally. "So am I." She leaned into him then, her head on his shoulder like when she was smaller. "Do you ever think about how different everything would be if I hadn't walked into your office?" He chuckled softly. "Every single day." The next morning, she left a note on his coffee mug. "Thanks for not walking away." Time passed, slowly at first, then all at once. Marina had good stretches, whole seasons where she moved easily, laughed freely, cooked dinner, and read books and teased Ethan about his inability to fold fitted sheets. Then the illness would return, quiet and sharp like a thief, and remind them that time was still borrowed. Grace grew, taller, louder, more herself with every year. Her art bloomed. She got into a magnet high school. She started winning competitions. She started tutoring younger students. She started looking more like Marina. And one evening, just shy of her 16th birthday, she asked Ethan to help her with a scholarship essay. "It's about people who shaped my life," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Am I allowed to know if I made the cut?" She smiled. "You're the title." The essay was raw and luminous. She didn't romanticize him. She didn't pretend he had been there from the beginning. She wrote about the day she walked into his office, about the first drawing, the first snack, the first time she felt seen. She wrote about how he showed up every day after, not with grand promises, but with presence. "He was supposed to be a stranger," she wrote, "but he chose to be my father." She won the scholarship. The night she got the letter, she ran across the lawn barefoot, waving it over her head. Marina stood on the porch, hands to her mouth. Ethan stepped outside just in time for Grace to throw herself into his arms. "We're going to make it," she whispered. "We already have," he said. Marina passed away the following year. It was peaceful. She was at home, in her favorite chair, the windows open, Grace's sketchbook open in her lap. Ethan held her hand. Grace sat on the floor, her head against her mother's leg. She left quietly, without pain, without fear. Her memorial was small. Grace painted a portrait for the service. Ethan spoke simply, honestly. He told the story of a woman who loved without limits, who made space for healing in the middle of hardship. After the guests left, he and Grace sat on the porch steps. "She asked me to remind you of the good parts," he said. "All of them." Grace nodded. "I remember everything." The house changed slowly after that. Ethan gave Grace time. He let her grief come and go like tides. They filled the silence with music, with new recipes, with late-night movie marathons when neither of them could sleep. And eventually, laughter returned. Grace graduated valedictorian. Ethan wept in the crowd. She gave a speech that made the entire gymnasium go still. She taught me how to fight. He taught me how to stay. I stand here because both of them showed me that love is not what we say. It's what we choose, every single day. Afterward, Ethan found her in the parking lot and pulled her into a hug. "You were perfect," he whispered. She grinned. "I was watching to see if you'd cry." Too late. She moved into a small dorm a few months later. Art school in Chicago. They FaceTimed daily. She sent him sketches every week, sometimes full drawings, sometimes just doodles, but always something. And one day he opened the mailbox and found a small canvas, a painting, a man in a gray suit kneeling beside a girl holding a crayon drawing. Behind them, a glass building towered. The title was written in the corner, "The Day My Father Found Me." Ethan hung it in the front hall of the house with the red door, and every morning after he passed it on the way out. And smiled, because some stories don't begin with love. They begin with loss. But when love chooses to stay, that's where everything begins again. Years passed like pages in a journal, softly turned, carefully kept, each one different but tied together by the thread of a story they never saw coming. Grace finished college with a degree in fine arts and a minor in childhood psychology. Her work had matured into something both intimate and expansive. Portraits of moments, slices of ordinary life that made people feel something long after they left the gallery. She called her senior exhibit Held, and the centerpiece was a painting titled The Quiet Years. A family curled together on a sagging couch, a teacup in the foreground, a crayon-streaked drawing taped to the window behind them. Ethan flew in for the show, wearing a scarf she'd knitted him years earlier. It was fraying now, but he wouldn't replace it. When he saw the painting, he didn't say a word, just stood there in the middle of the crowd with tears on his cheeks and his hands in his pockets, trying to steady the weight in his chest. Later that night, over takeout containers and tired laughter in her small apartment, Grace asked him, "Did you ever imagine this?" He looked around the room, at the cluttered shelves, the stack of canvases in the corner, the mug she'd painted as a child now holding pens beside her bed. "I never imagined anything past boardrooms," he said honestly. "But you taught me how to dream differently." She reached for his hand and gave it a squeeze. "You stayed. That's all I ever needed." After graduation, she returned home, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to help rebuild what they had made together. She converted the old garage studio into a full teaching space for local kids, offering free Saturday classes to children who, like her once, didn't always feel seen. Ethan helped build the shelves. He carried in boxes of supplies. He watched the children draw and giggle and whisper about how cool Miss Grace was. And every so often one of the kids would wander into the kitchen where he was organizing snacks and ask, "Are you her dad?" And every time he'd smile and say, "Yeah, I'm the lucky one." Grace never stopped drawing. Ethan never stopped showing up. On her 27th birthday, he gave her a leather-bound book filled with every drawing she'd ever given him. From the crayon sketch that started it all to the most recent, a watercolor of the sycamore tree in their backyard, now taller than their roof. On the final page, he'd written, "You gave me a life. I only knew how to build things until I met you. You showed me how to live." She cried when she read it, not with sorrow, but with fullness, the kind that only comes when every piece of the past is seen, honored, and gently laid down. When Ethan turned 70, Grace threw him a party in that same backyard. The red door had been repainted a dozen times over the years, but it still stood like a promise. The garden had grown wilder. The wind chimes Marina had once loved still hung from the porch. Friends came, neighbors, Former students, people Ethan had helped quietly, families he'd sponsored, kids he'd mentored, nonprofits he'd funded without putting his name on anything. And in the middle of it all, Grace stood on the makeshift stage and cleared her throat. "I used to think I found him," she said. "That day I walked into his office. But the truth is, we found each other. I didn't just get a father, I got a place to land, a place to grow, a place to come home to." She looked at him, eyes shining, and he didn't have to do it. That's what makes it matter. He chose to. After the party, long after the sun had set and the guests had gone, they sat on the back steps watching the stars come out one by one. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Changing your whole life?" He didn't answer right away. Then he leaned back, looked up at the sky, and said, "Not once." Grace nodded. "I think Mom would be proud." "I know she is." Silence stretched between them, but it was the kind that holds, not the kind that breaks. Because some stories don't end with fanfare. They end like this, with a girl who found her voice, with a man who found his heart, and with a life they built together word by word, picture by picture, until they no longer had to wonder what might have been, because what was more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. 3 more years passed before Grace's life changed again, not with heartbreak this time, but with something gentler, a beginning. She met someone, a fellow artist, quiet, thoughtful, curious in all the ways that mattered. His name was Micah, and the first time he came to dinner, he brought a bouquet of sunflowers and a homemade blueberry pie that was slightly overcooked, but made Grace laugh until she cried. Ethan, now older but no less observant, watched their interactions with a mix of awe and the quiet protectiveness that never truly faded. He could see it, the way Grace leaned in just slightly when Micah spoke, the way her eyes lingered on his face when he laughed. It wasn't infatuation. It was real. After dinner, while Grace was washing dishes and Micah was helping dry, Ethan stepped outside for air. Micah followed. "Can I ask you something, sir?" he said. Ethan turned. "If you call me sir again, I might throw a shoe at you." Micah smiled nervously. "Okay, Ethan." "What's your question?" "I wanted to ask for your blessing. Not because Grace needs it, but because I'd be honored to have it." Ethan looked at him, studied the steadiness in his eyes, the earnest way he stood there vulnerable without apology. "Are you going to love her on her bad days?" Ethan asked. "Yes." "Will you protect her heart even when she's hard to understand?" "I'll spend my life learning how." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then I'm honored too." They married in the backyard a year later, under the sycamore tree that had grown taller than the house. The same chimes that had once sung for Marina danced in the wind above them. The red door had been repainted again, this time by Grace and Ethan together, in deep maroon, lined with gold vines. The ceremony was small, honest. Ethan gave the speech. "When she walked into my office all those years ago," he said, voice thick, "I thought she came looking for something I didn't have. But the truth is, she brought everything I was missing. Grace didn't just ask me to become her father, she showed me how." He looked at her, radiant and calm, her hand in Micah's. "And today she teaches me again how to open my heart, how to trust that love, real love, doesn't walk away. It stays, it roots, and if we're lucky, it grows into something that lasts long after we're gone." That night when the candles were blown out and the guests had gone, Grace and Ethan stood beneath the sycamore tree, barefoot in the grass, arms around each other. "I wish she could have seen this," Grace whispered. "She does," Ethan said. "She's in every petal, every breeze." Grace nodded. "You think you'll ever move? Travel?" "Why?" he asked. "Planning to kick me out now that you've got a husband?" She grinned. "No, I'm planning to give you grandkids one day. You'll need a bigger kitchen." They laughed, and he pulled her close. When Micah joined them a moment later, Ethan reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of her," he said. Micah didn't answer. He just nodded, because some promises are too big for words. As the years wound on, the seasons repeated their quiet, loyal cycle. Grace opened a full gallery, taught, mentored, gave scholarships in Marina's name. Ethan retired from business entirely and wrote a book, not about money, but about the unexpected ways family can be built from nothing but a choice and a chance. It became a quiet bestseller. He donated the profits to single-parent programs across the country. Eventually, his hands began to shake a little more. His steps slowed. But Grace's visits never did. She brought her children with her, first one, then two. And they all called him Grandpa like they'd never known anything else. In his final days, he didn't want hospitals. He wanted home. He wanted the red door, the kitchen smells, the wind through the chimes, the warmth of crayons and light. Grace sat with him often, sometimes just holding his hand, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes sitting in silence, which no longer felt like absence, but like presence wearing softer clothes. One night, just before sleep, he whispered, "I never thanked you enough." "For what?" she said. "For walking into my office, for choosing me." Grace squeezed his hand. "You chose me too." He smiled. And when he closed his eyes for the last time, he did so with peace in his chest, not because he had conquered the world, but because he had found his place in it. Grace kept the house with the red door. She repainted it again. Her children played beneath the sycamore tree. And on the living room wall above the fireplace hung a painting. A girl, a man, a crayon drawing in her hand, and the title, "Where Love Begins." Years later, long after the gallery had been renamed the Ray Lockridge Center for Creative Healing, after the chimes had faded from age and been lovingly restored by Grace's children, a journalist came to interview her. She was nearing 50 then, silver dusted through her curls, paint on her palms, wisdom behind her smile. The reporter asked her about her biggest success. She expected the answer to be about the gallery, or the scholarships, or her best-selling memoir, Crayon Foundations. But Grace paused for a long moment and then said, "My biggest success is that I was loved." The journalist tilted her head. "That's rare to hear." Grace smiled. "It shouldn't be." She walked the woman to the front door of the house with the red door, restored now but never replaced. Children's voices carried from the backyard where Grace's grandchildren were painting stones, just as she had once done in that very same grass. On the way out, the reporter noticed the frame in the foyer, a worn sketch, clearly drawn by a child's hand, of a stick figure, man with a speech bubble above him, "Why didn't you come back?" And below it, a second frame, same paper, same figures. But this time the speech bubble read, "I stayed." Grace looked at them, her eyes soft. "He didn't know," she said quietly, "but once he did, he never left. And that changed everything." The journalist nodded, her voice caught in her throat. "Would you say your story has a happy ending?" Grace thought about it. About the man who once lived in skyscrapers and silence. About the woman who had quietly borne too much. About the girl who dared to walk into a stranger's office with nothing but a drawing and a heart full of hope. "No," she said, "it didn't end. It just kept becoming." As the door closed behind them, the wind caught the chimes once more, and the red door stood firm against time. Not as a symbol, but as a truth. That love chosen, love stayed, is the greatest masterpiece of all. Sometimes, when the house was quiet and the sky turned that soft lavender just before dusk, Grace would sit on the back steps with a cup of tea and look out across the yard. She would close her eyes and listen, to wind, to memory, to the echoes of a little girl who once believed in something more. And every time she opened her eyes, she would smile, because what they built, what they chose, had never left. It lived on in every crayon line, every red door, every quiet moment filled with the kind of love that didn't ask to be noticed. It simply stayed.